So Shibata-sensei, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here. As Shibata-sensei mentioned, I had the privilege of living in Japan in the mid-'80s and for a year and a half. And it was a wonderful experience for me that I never forgot. And even though I went to work in Washington, for half of the time I was as a lawyer and half on the policy side at the State Department, I always loved coming back to Japan and always sought as many contacts with Japanese government as possible during that time. So it's really great to be here. I had been invited to come just when I was still in government service, but right before the pandemic began, and I was supposed to come here and give a lecture, and then I was going to come with my family, and it was going to be great fun, and then the pandemic hit, and all of our lives kind of changed. But in any event, I'm glad to be here at this point, and to have the opportunity to talk about both poles. So it's great to do that here because I think that Shibata-sensei can be very proud of what he has done with this institution, bringing so many learned people here to study and work with him. It is a place that's extremely well known internationally, participated through him in many international negotiations. And so this is sort of the heart, as far as I'm concerned, of the Japanese focus on polar law and polar policy. So it's really great to be here. So this is a very broad topic, but it's one that's of particular, well, there's several of particular interest to me because I had some special experiences while I was at the State Department. As a junior attorney, I was called in when the Canadians said they had this idea to establish something called the Arctic Council. And I was a junior lawyer. There was no Arctic law portfolio within the State Department, but they said, these Canadians, they want to do this thing, and we don't know what it is. Would you go out and negotiate the declaration and rules of procedure and all that kind of stuff? So I was there at the beginning of something that was very interesting, and throughout then subsequent positions was able to follow this fascinating institution, from the Arctic Council from the beginning to where we are now, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I also had the opportunity to begin going to Antarctic Treaty meetings very early in my career as a lawyer, and then subsequently became the head of delegation to the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings and to CAMLR, and did that for 15 years until I retired from the State Department, as was mentioned at the end of 2020. So I've had the opportunity to look at these connections and the parallels between Arctic and Antarctic. And there are not a lot of places where you can come and talk about both. But I think that there are parallels, there are connections. They're by no means the same, of course. But we'll talk about what some of those linkages are. So I'm going to focus today on what on U.S. policy in the polar regions. And I should be careful to say that I'm no longer a government official, so what I say reflects my own point of view, but is based upon work I've done over some years. So I think it's true to say that the U.S. government gives more prominence to its role in the polar regions than some would realize. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that makes the top of the news in the U.S. or perhaps or U.S. policy in other places, but there are any number of people and agencies and serious efforts to manage U.S. policy when it comes to both poles. So as you'll appreciate, the U.S. is an Arctic state by virtue of Alaska, and has long been concerned with security matters in particular related to the region. But the U.S. also has the largest presence of any country in Antarctica. It originally proposed the Antarctic Treaty to deal with Cold War pressures, and the U.S. follows developments there very closely. In both cases, for the U.S., there is a strong relationship to oceans policy and law, including the law of the sea, and we'll talk more about that. And there's a strong interest in the science that takes place in both regions, especially in relation to climate change and in protecting the United States' ability to carry out science in both polar regions. A little bit of water here. So let's see. U.S. Arctic policy. So as I mentioned, the U.S. focus on Arctic policy starts with Alaska. Alaska is our largest state. If it were an independent country, it would be the 16th largest country in the world, larger than Iran. It is about 4.5 times bigger than Japan. It only became a state in 1959, and it was, yes, indeed, purchased from Russia in 1867. Thus, for the U.S., governance of Alaska is primarily an issue of U.S. domestic law, both federal and state law. And the same idea is true for the Arctic as a whole. And the Arctic as a whole is largely made up of areas within national jurisdiction. So it's not some sort of wild west where you don't know what law applies. And it's important to sort of keep that in mind when thinking about Arctic governance generally. So, thus, for the U.S. and Alaska, domestic political issues are of particular importance, including related to indigenous peoples, energy, economic development, etc. Now, there is a definition in U.S. law that is found in the Arctic Research and Policy Act of 1984. And under that act, the Arctic is defined, and you see in this, this map over here is basically that area. In that context, the Arctic is defined as all U.S. and foreign territory north of the Arctic Circle, all U.S. territory north and west of the boundary formed by the Porcupine, Yukon, and Kuskokwim rivers, all contiguous seas, including the Arctic Ocean and the Beaufort, Bering, and Chukchi seas, and the Aleutian Island chain. So, but this is not always what people mean by the Arctic, but it has some relevance when you're talking about research, particularly research funded or undertaken by U.S. agencies. Now, the Arctic Council, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, doesn't have a single definition of the Arctic, but it relies on context depending upon what issue is being talked about. So there's no one size fits all, but from a U.S. perspective, that can sometimes be relevant. Now, what are the key policy documents? So U.S. policy, Arctic policy, has evolved over time. So there have been a number of important policy documents, but I'm not going to walk you through all of them. The most recent, and I think the one that needs to be thought about at the moment, is in that box down at the bottom, which is the National Strategy for the Arctic Region, which the U.S. administration issued in October of last year. So this had been prepared earlier in the Biden administration, but it was held up for most of a year because of the need to consider the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it focuses on advancing U.S. interests across 4 pillars covering both domestic and international issues. So there are 4 pillars relating to security, climate change and environmental protection, sustainable economic development, and international cooperation and governance. So the major difference, there was a previous NSAR, National Strategy for the Arctic Region, that was issued under the Obama administration. And the principal differences between the Biden policy and the Obama policy is that, first, this policy, at least the thinking within the administration, is that they wanted it to last for about 10 years. So beyond the point at which the administration would have gone away. And it also takes into account geopolitics of the current world in light of the Ukraine crisis. And it takes into account developments since 2013 on economic issues such as new technologies like broadband, issues related to critical minerals, the need to develop infrastructure and content with dealing with permafrost melt and moving away from carbon extraction. Also of particular importance is strong support reflected in the document for the Arctic Council, which is particularly relevant at a time when the activities of the Council have been undercut by the Ukraine crisis. Now, about 28 U.S. federal agencies have some involvement in Arctic policy. And foreign policy for the Arctic is led by the U.S. Department of State, which was my agency, and is our foreign ministry. So let's talk about U.S. Arctic foreign policy. So that Arctic foreign policy has many different elements. It centers for the most part on the Arctic Council, of which the U.S. was a founding member in 1996. Now, the Council is the main diplomatic forum for the region, and the U.S. over time has developed increasing confidence in the Arctic Council. There were originally concerns, as I implied earlier, about what it was, what the Canadians really had in mind. But now I would say that in terms of U.S. policy, it has truly been embraced. Now, there are issues related to the Ukraine crisis that we'll talk about, but I think it's fair to say that it had turned into quite a success until we hit this kind of bump in the road. So key elements of U.S. foreign policy in the Arctic include bilateral relationships with other Arctic states, Canada probably being the closest, but also with non-Arctic states. There are security issues, including national defense, missile defense, operation of submarines. Coast Guard operations are very important in the Arctic. Marine safety, including search and rescue. Issues related to economic development, connected to the Alaskan economy, to shipping, to fisheries, including within the U.S. domestic EEZ and the Central Arctic Ocean Agreement, which we may discuss. There are a lot of issues related to energy, and the focus on energy has changed over time, including with the focus on climate change. Environment and climate change are key issues. Scientific research, in particular related to climate change, and then relations with indigenous peoples and local communities. So all of these one could spend a great deal of time talking about, but are important elements of U.S. policy. Now, U.S. foreign policy in the Arctic also focuses on application of law of the sea, given that the key feature of the Arctic is that it is an ocean surrounded by land. The U.S. is not a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but as a general matter, it treats UNCLOS as reflecting customary international law. So there are any number of other Arctic issues that one could talk about. Maritime boundaries. We have an open boundary with Canada in the Beaufort Sea. There is application of Article 234, the Law of the Sea Convention, the status of the Northern Sea Route, Northwest Passage, issues related to Greenland. So all of it is quite multifaceted. But there's that other pole. So let's talk about the other pole. U.S. has a number of policy interests when it comes to Antarctica as well. Unlike with the Arctic, the U.S. has no territory or claim to territory in Antarctica. And it denies the existing claims of the 7 states that render claims in Antarctica, and historically maintains what's called a basis of claim that's reflected in the Antarctic Treaty. And in that respect, the U.S. is like Russia. So in legal circumstances, the U.S. and Russia have a kind of special status in relation to the Antarctic Treaty. It doesn't mean that the U.S. government or serious people run around thinking that we're going to make a claim to the entire continent, but back in the 50s, this was kind of part of the consideration in the political background. The main U.S. concrete current interest relates to its scientific presence in Antarctica, which includes 3 all-year research stations, including Antarctica's largest station, McMurdo Station, and the only station at the geographic South Pole, Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station. Thus, the U.S. has the most people in Antarctica of any country, likely the best logistics capabilities as well, and it probably spends the most, although precise figures for all national programs are hard to come by. So the U.S. has long-term geopolitical interests and concerns with respect to Antarctica and wants to prevent tensions there from leading to any sort of conflict or discord. So there's certainly a security backdrop to the policy perspective. Now, the key policy documents, I should say, that there are actually very few of these, at least in terms of what is publicly available. The last official White House policy directive was released in 1994, covering both poles. So, and there are a number of speeches by secretaries of state and that sort of thing, but most of it, in terms of policy development, goes on internally within the U.S. government. Now, the National Science Foundation, which is a U.S. agency, runs the U.S. Antarctic Program, and that's the umbrella program for all U.S. agencies and programs in Antarctica. State Department leads on foreign policy and develops positions that the U.S. government takes at the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings and at the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, CAMLR, and each of these bodies meets once a year. So what is the focus of U.S. Antarctic policy? I'd say the first element of that is to promote science. The U.S. has the largest presence, as I've mentioned, of any country, and wants to promote a wide range of science activities and to protect U.S. interests of its personnel and science programs in Antarctica. Now then, peace and security. The Clinton-era policy said that a key U.S. objective was maintaining Antarctica as an area of international cooperation reserved exclusively for peaceful purposes. So the U.S. wants to ensure non-militarization of the continent, which is already provided in the Antarctic Treaty, but to make sure that that principle continues to be secure. So it also wants to understand the behavior and avoid encroachments by strategic adversaries, namely China and Russia. But this does not mean lack of cooperation with those countries. And yet the Ukraine conflict has made cooperation with Russia particularly problematic. So unlike in 2012, which you said I gave you the patch from 2012, one of my jobs was to lead U.S. inspections under the Antarctic Treaty in Antarctica, and I led four inspections of foreign research stations in Antarctica. And two of those I did jointly with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it was an absolutely fascinating and entirely fruitful exercise with both governments completely committed, and I had the opportunity not only to visit dozens of stations, but to stay at Russian stations that I think very few, at least Americans, have had the opportunity to do. So it's like another age, and sadly, but there was an opportunity we found at least a decade ago when those sort of things were possible. So we also, the U.S. also wants to guard against any sort of instability that could lead to conflict. And of course, that has a focus on the claims at various points. Now, environmental protection is also a key focus. When the Clinton policy was issued, the environmental protocol to the Antarctic Treaty had been signed but not yet entered into force. So there's a lot of updating that really needs to be done. But conservation and sustainable management of living resources is a key objective, and that's particularly important in the context of fisheries and camelar. And finally, I'd say that a U.S. goal is to promote the longevity and resilience of the treaty system that we helped create. So let's talk a little bit about international governance at the poles. Governance in the Arctic and Antarctic overlap in some ways. So one aspect of that is the importance of law of the sea. Another is that consensus-based decision-making is at the heart of the Arctic Council, as well as in the Antarctic Treaty System. And you will know the Antarctic Treaty System is more or less, there's a involved definition, but really what we're talking about is the Antarctic Treaty and the protocol and the camelar. You have many of the same countries play leading roles in both poles, and that certainly includes the US and Russia. There's a key focus on science, and there are issues of logistics and ice breaking in the both polar regions that are relevant to each other. But there are also some major differences. So in the South, the cooperation is treaty-based. The Arctic Council is not a treaty-based organization. It is not an international organization, as that term is understood in international law. Now, as I mentioned before, most areas within the Arctic are within national jurisdiction, either maritime or terrestrial. And from a US point of view, Antarctica is not owned by anyone, and that's the position taken by most countries in the world. But it is subject to some claims, and those claims have relevance is not only to the land, but to maritime, whether there are maritime zones as well. So let's talk a little about the Ukraine conflict and its implications. So there are many implications of that conflict for polar governance, mostly in relation to issues related to Russia. It's a particularly tricky situation because of consensus-based decision-making that is at the core of the Council, the ATCM, and CAMLR. Now, as many of you know, the work of the Arctic Council has been paused since March 3rd of last year, with limited resumption of activities not involving Russia on June 8th. This approach honors the consensus rule, but still has had a major impact, on the Russian chairmanship, which is ongoing in the Council. And the issue of how the chairmanship passes to Norway, which is the intention and expectation, how it does that this May is a very complex question, and people like Timo Koivarova and I have been in many discussions with a lot of people about what that means and what the Arctic Council senior Arctic officials are trying to grapple with at the moment. There are major implications for science in relation to the Ukraine conflict that involve Russia and Russians. Certain areas of cooperation related to climate change, including data and actions by the Russian government, present serious difficulties. So the notion of Arctic exceptionalism has been damaged, and there are increased security concerns which are driving countries like Finland and Sweden to join NATO. And once that has finally occurred, 7 of the 8 Arctic states will then be NATO members, which does have important political and security consequences. Now, the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement held its first conference of the parties in Korea with the Russians present in the fall of last year, and this meeting worked well procedurally. We have seen continued cooperation with regard to fisheries and some Coast Guard activities. So it's not that there is no cooperation going on, but it is more limited, and there are some particular contexts. Now, with respect to the Antarctic, although the meetings were tense at times, last year's Antarctic Treaty Consultative meeting and the CAMLR Commission meeting, they were able to continue their work with the Russians present. The ATCM had difficulties in adopting its report, and at CAMLR, Russia ultimately did not block the report or the appointment of a Ukrainian as the next commission chair. So I think those particular facts are particularly relevant. But I think it's also important to note that even where meetings continue with the Russians, there has been a degradation of cooperation and atmosphere, which makes cooperation on environmental and other matters much more difficult. That will continue, in my view, until the Ukraine conflict is resolved one way or the other. So, a few thoughts about key governance challenges. There are numerous issues of concern to the US, Japan, other governments, Finland, all these various issues that one could talk about in the context of a kind of bipolar perspective. And whether polar governance is in fact successful depends upon how relevant institutions can meet challenges and promote cooperation. So I don't have an exclusive list, but here are a few areas to focus on. One is related to environmental protection. So issues related to marine protected areas, which are within the jurisdiction of CAMLR, are now blocked by Russia and China in the context of Antarctica. So that is a major policy issue and challenge for many different countries that they're trying to face right now. There's also the need, of course, to promote polar science and its contribution to climate science globally. There's a need to protect species and biodiversity at both poles. And then, of course, there are issues related to sea level rise caused by melting ice in Antarctica and in Greenland. There are also a suite of economic issues. There's a need for sustainable development in the north for the benefit of the peoples who live there. And there are challenges related to fisheries management at both poles. And fisheries tend to be relatively well managed in both places, but that's only due to efforts being made by a wide variety of governments which need to continue. And then there's the need to continue to prevent mining in Antarctica, which is outlawed by Article 7 of the Environmental Protocol. And there continue to be concerns about how viable that limitation will continue on into the future, even though legally it's quite solid at this point. In terms of security, there's the need to continue the non-militarization of Antarctica and to prevent any tensions that might be caused by claims. As you be aware, there are certain issues where the UK and Argentina tend to sort of butt heads, and that relates to the claims in Antarctica as well. In the Arctic, there is the need to consider military affairs and to what degree they may increase in the context of, I mean, already it's not an area that can be described as non-militarized at all. I mean, there is active military activity in the Arctic, but the current tensions in Ukraine are making things more difficult. And then I'd mention the question of opening up of polar governance to more states. In the Arctic, non-Arctic states already play a key role in international institutions, such as UNCLOS, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, in ICAO, on aviation, et cetera. So there is this question of whether Japan, China, and others will be satisfied as observers in the Arctic Council, even though it isn't a regulatory body. And in Antarctica, can the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties and CAMLR members continue with their monopoly on governance? Will, for example, the UN play a role? There have been attempts some years ago to have a greater influence of the UN, and this, I would say, also has some direct relevance in relation to the BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, High Seas Treaty negotiations, which are now ongoing in New York. So I think I will stop there, and thank you for the opportunity to make these remarks.
Thank you.